Ready, excited and alert, energized, interested? Excellent. Thank you all so much. Hopeful, ready? Great. A lot of readies. Excellent. Folks, sounds like people have their coffee. They're ready to go. And a reminder too, I recognize, this is a Saturday morning. It's a 3-hour meeting, even though we do have a break and we have more reflection time and more time for Q&A. If at any time you need to get up, you need to stretch your legs, you need to grab a snack or something to drink, take a tiny mini break, please take care of yourselves throughout the course of the morning as well. And starting with a land acknowledgement as well, that we wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on traditional lands of the indigenous people who've been here since time immemorial. There are 29 federally recognized tribes and 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal people bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment. Tribes bring an important and vital voice to our current conversation, and we honor tribal relations. And with that, I want to formally and informally welcome all of you and turn it over to Mike to walk through today's agenda.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. Again, welcome everyone to today's agenda. So first of all, again, just reminding people about your feedback. So we're going to just show you where you can provide feedback. Again, this is your assembly, so we want to be responsive to how we can improve and how we can tailor this assembly process for you. We'll then have a set of presentations, and then we'll have a break in between where we'll also have time in breakout rooms to just process and debrief some of the presentations in the same groups that we did at the end of the Tuesday learning session. Then we'll have a second part of presentations, and then we'll do the breakout rooms around the campfire again, and then outline next steps and conclude. So some of the things what we heard from learning session 2, we learned a lot about the basics of climate change, the causes of climate change, and the role of carbon emissions in the greenhouse effect from Dr. Amy Snover, Dr. Chris Ebi, and Dr. Deb Morrison. We also learned about climate impacts across Washington State, the United States, and across the world from Dr. Snover, Dr. Claire Richards, and Dr. Ebi, understanding that climate impacts are not felt equally by everyone. And then finally, we learned about the composition of statewide carbon emissions from Hester and how transportation is a large part of those statewide carbon emissions. We learned from Hester and Dr. Morrison about the potential climate change and climate mitigation solutions within the transportation and the education sectors as well. So again, framing this in the broader, I guess the syllabus that we're going through with each other is, we talked about the basics of climate change. We talked about how climate impacts affect different communities differently and beginning to learn some of the solutions. And today we're going to be learning about what are some of the environmental considerations, what are some of the impacts and the potential that the environment can play in the role for climate mitigation in Washington State. And so going over some of the meeting objectives. So what are some of the learning objectives that we have in mind for you today? So today we have multiple experts who will be presenting on some of the environmental considerations of climate impacts and climate mitigation solutions. Well, you will hear from multiple experts about climate impacts on a variety of Washington's ecosystems, including forests, marine ecosystems, and wildlife, and other types of habitats. We will also hear from experts and interested parties on the role that these natural ecosystems can play and the potential that they have for climate mitigation. Finally, we will continue to build off of this knowledge and this learning with other experts and interested parties who will begin to draw connections between the environment and other sectors that deal with sustainability. So I'll turn it back over to Gretchen to quickly walk through the feedback again.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mike. And yeah, just wanting to remind you all of 4 potential ways to provide feedback. One is in these meetings in real time, submitting questions to presenters in the chat. The other is if there's a topic you want to dive more deeply into or want more information about, to please let us know. On the website, there is a link to a place where you can also upload and share independent research. So if you have time and interest and wanting to dive more deeply into any particular area related to this assembly, and you found a document that you really think is great and want to share it with your fellow assembly members, that's where you can do it. And then also the general feedback. And so at the end of each session, we'll be providing a link in the chat and for a feedback form. And we read these diligently, and we go through them, and we think about ways to incorporate the feedback that we're hearing from you all and try to work in the suggestions that we've heard. And this is Washington State's first ever People's Assembly, and we're committing to making improvements every step of the way. So please let us know. And we've updated the feedback form, so it's new and improved from Tuesday. So please check it out after this meeting and share your thoughts. And for instance, how is this information being used? So we got feedback about having more opportunities for smaller group discussions. So we've incorporated that in 2 ways today. One is moving you all into breakout rooms during the break. So you have the option for casual conversation during break if you'd like to use your break that way for either part or the whole time. We've also carved out additional time at the end, and we're calling it around the campfire, and as a breakout session. So doing what we did on Tuesday, but extending the time a bit more. We've carved out additional time for Q&A sessions. And we've also created an online folder that we'll send you all a link to, which will include all past presentations. It will include resources that have been shared by presenters, as well as a glossary that we'll keep adding to. And these will be terms that we've been hearing from each of the presenters that may not be a word that we use in everyday conversations. And if there are words that come up that are unfamiliar to you as well, please let us know and we'll add those to the glossary as well. So really just can't iterate enough that your feedback is really important. We read it and we try to incorporate what we can within the parameters of this assembly. So thank you all so much. And with that, we will go ahead and move into our presentations. And we've got 2 parts similar to what we did last Saturday, part 1 and then part 2. And we are kicking off and are lucky to have Dr. Mead Crosby, who will be presenting on climate impacts on habitat and wildlife as an expert presenter. Dr. Crosby is a senior scientist with the University of Washington's Climate Impacts Group and the university's deputy director of the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center. Dr. Crosby has spent the past decade working collaboratively with federal, state, and local governments, tribes and First Nations, non-governmental organizations, and communities to address climate risks to species and ecosystems. The learning objective from her presentation is to learn about the impacts of climate change on habitat and wildlife. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Mead Crosby.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. I'm going to talk about how climate change is affecting Washington's wildlife and habitat. I know you guys have had a couple learning sessions already, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the basics around the changes that are happening, that are driving what's happening to these species, but I'm going to start with some general trends in the kinds of things that we're seeing in wildlife here and around the world because of climate change, and then some specifics about the things that we're seeing in Washington's wildlife and habitats. So some of the things that we're seeing globally that's also playing out here include changes in the timing of biological events. And so what do I mean by that? Things like when leaves come out in the spring, when flowers come out in the spring, when insects emerge from their winter hibernation, when birds return from migration in the spring and lay eggs. So all of these biological events, they're all closely attuned to things like climate, and species are responding to warming by changing the timing of when they do these things, and they're doing them earlier. So spring has actually been getting earlier around 3 days per decade in the Northern Hemisphere, like where we are. Birds are coming back earlier, leaves are coming out earlier, flowers are coming out earlier. And these are good things because this means that species are adapting. This is one way that they adapt to climate change. The problem is that they're not all changing the timing at the same rate. So then we get into problems where you have things like flowers coming out before bumblebees emerge, for example, and now your pollinators are not aligned with the flowers that they pollinate. Or you have insects emerging because they're up in the north and they're coming out earlier in spring, but the migratory birds are still down in South America or Central America, and they're coming back too late and the insects are gone, and that's what they feed their babies. And so these mismatches in timing are a real problem and something that we're concerned about under climate change. Another thing that we're seeing is that species are changing their distribution. So the ranges of species, where you find a species on the landscape, these ranges are changing. And they're changing again in an adaptive way, and that this is another way that species respond to climate change. It's not just by changing the timing of when they do things, but also where they're found. So as it's been getting warmer, on average globally, species ranges have been shifting northward and upward. So they're moving their ranges to stay climatically comfortable as it warms. They're moving to cooler places. Again, this is a good thing, right? They're adapting. This is how they've always adapted to change. The problem is that climate is changing extremely rapidly right now, more rapidly than in millions of years. And so it's difficult for species to keep up. And especially species that don't have wings or species that can't move very quickly. And some species just don't have anywhere to go. So for example, here in Washington, we have these adorable critters, pika, that live way up in alpine habitats up at the tops of mountains. The only place to go is up. So they have a really hard time adjusting their ranges because at the edges of their range, they'd have to go down mountains and back up and, like travel across the landscape. It's very difficult for them to do that. So we're seeing at the southern edges of their range, like in the Sierra Nevada and California, these guys are starting to disappear. And you'll see things like that that southern edge of ranges starting to move northward as they just can't keep up with the changes that are happening. So that's a problem. We expect to see dramatic changes in where species are found. Some ranges will shrink, some species will disappear, some will be winners and their ranges will grow. But on average, this is not a good thing for plants and animals that they're having to keep up with really rapid changes. The other thing is, just like species are changing the timing of their events, not all at the same pace, they're not all moving at the same pace either. And they're not all moving in exactly the same places. On average, they're moving up and they're moving north. But they're all taking slightly different paths. Their ranges are all responding differently. And so what that means is that we can actually wind up with really different kinds of ecological communities. And when I say ecological community, I mean the plants and animals that you find in a given area. So you go into a forest in Washington State, say on the west side of the Cascades, you kind of know what you expect to see. I'll see some hemlock, some fir, there'll be some huckleberry. That's an ecological community. Maybe there's some deer. Those communities, even though they seem very permanent to us, they've changed a lot over historical time. We've always had changes in our ecological communities. But with the pace of climate change happening now and how quickly species are moving, we expect to see pretty different communities emerge in the future. We might have very different looking forests. We might have very different alpine communities, like up here with, we have trees moving into alpine meadows. On average, there is much less uncertainty around what that might look like west of the Cascades. We'll probably still have evergreen forests, conifer forests. It might be a little bit different than what we've had in the past. There's more uncertainty around what's going to happen east of the Cascades, like in the Columbia Plateau. Questions about how much grassland versus shrub versus forest might be there. We could have some pretty dramatic changes, and we don't know exactly what those will look like yet. The other thing to consider is that while species are adjusting their ranges and they're all trying to keep up with climate change and stay in climatically suitable areas, This isn't a sort of slow, steady process. It actually can happen pretty quickly and pretty dramatically. And typically these changes will happen after a big disturbance. And by disturbance, I mean something like a big fire or a flood or some other event that can change the landscape very quickly. And so after a fire, you might have had a forest there, for example, and the trees there could handle some warming. They could handle some drier summers, but maybe their seedlings can't. Maybe their seeds won't germinate and give rise to these seedlings and the new generation of trees under these hotter and drier conditions. And so that forest might be replaced by grass or something else that's better adapted to that heat, or different kinds of trees that are better adapted to these new conditions. And so when we see these changes in ecological communities and what kind of plants and animals we find in a spot, it'll often happen quite quickly after events like big fires. And we've been seeing more fire, and I know Dr. Hawlowski is going to talk more about this later. And we're seeing more fire because it's getting drier, it's getting hotter in the summer, it's hotter and drier for longer. And our forests are stressed by these conditions. And so we're having more insect and pathogen outbreaks, more diseases. And in the near term, these insects and pathogens give rise to more fire. And so our forests are stressed, they're burning more often. And again, I think maybe someone's going to talk more about this later, but these larger wildfires are expected to reduce the ability of our forests to store carbon. And so this is also a concern. And so the more we can do to restore our forests, and we've been suppressing fire for a long time in our forests, the more we can do to remove these extra fuels, to restore more natural fire regimes, the more resilient our forests will be and the more carbon they'll be able to store. So the warming temperatures that we're seeing, which you probably heard about in the last two sessions, are leading to habitat loss also for species that depend on snow, on cold environments, and in particular snow. So we've lost about 25% of our snowpack in the Cascades. Since mid-20th century, we've lost a lot of ice. And some species really need this snow and this ice, species like wolverine. If you don't know about these guys, they are amazing creatures. They can travel huge distances. They are so hardy, and they are just sort of icons of our remote, rugged landscapes in Washington. But they need snow, and they don't just need any snow. They need a lot of snow, and they need it in the spring. And they dig into the snow, and that's where they have babies, and that's where they raise them. And so spring snowpack in particular is disappearing in the Cascades because it's getting warmer earlier, it's melting earlier, and these guys are losing their habitat. And by the end of the century, there's really dramatic reductions in our spring snowpack in Washington, and it doesn't look that great for wolverine and their ability to stay in our state past the end of the century. So everything we can do to mitigate and reduce that loss of spring snowpack and keep it colder longer for more snow will do good things for species like wolverine that depend on that. Our freshwater species, our fishes, are also going to be really affected by the changing conditions, and that's especially true of salmon. So salmon are affected by climate change at every stage in their pretty complex life cycle. So, for example, when they lay their eggs in freshwater streams and rivers, those are really sensitive to things like winter flooding, which we're going to see more of under climate change. So we're going to have less of our winter precipitation falling as snow, and more of it falling as rain, and more of that rain, and it's going to go right into our rivers and streams, and we're going to have more flooding, higher flows. Those can wash away salmon eggs out of our stream and also introduce a lot of sediment, a lot of grit and dirt into our streams, which is not good for salmon development. So both of those things affect salmon when they're very young. When they get out into the ocean, we have these warmer oceans that are acidifying, they're becoming more acidic. That's affecting the food that salmon eat out in the ocean. And so they're having a harder time getting the food they need to grow over those years they're in the ocean to return back to our streams. When they get back to our streams, they're getting warmer. The streams are getting warmer in the summer because our summers are warmer. And salmon are very sensitive to warm water. They can't survive beyond a certain threshold of warm water. And they will they will die and they can't pass through these really hot waters. And we've had salmon die-offs during particularly warm spells and warm spells of warm water. So this is a problem. And again, the more warming we have, the more this will be a problem, the harder the impact on salmon in Washington. At the same time, because we have our snowpack diminishing and the amount of snow that we have in the spring, that's our summer water for our streams. And so we're seeing lower summer flow. So our rivers are becoming barriers to salmon returning to breed because they're getting warmer and because there's less water there to begin with. So they have, it can be much harder for them to move upstream to get to where they need to breed. We're also seeing sea level rise. Globally, I know you've already talked about sea level rise in your earlier sessions. You probably talked about the fact that in Washington state, different areas are seeing different relative amounts of sea level rise because our coastlines are kind of rising and falling in different areas at different rates because of sort of the mountain building going on where we live and tectonic plates. But on average, we're seeing sea level rise in Washington state, and that affects our coastal habitats. So coastal marshes, and all the different habitats we have, our estuarine habitats, where our freshwater meets the sea, all of those habitats are being affected by the salt water that's moving into these freshwater areas along the coast, and also sea level rise making these coastal habitats disappear underwater or having to shift inland. So just like other species are having to move, our coastal habitats are having to move. They're having to keep up as the water rises and move inland and reestablish. And then we're also, I mentioned ocean acidification a moment ago around salmon. That's not just affecting salmon's food out in the deep ocean, it's also affecting our coastal waters. Washington is kind of a canary in the coal mine around ocean acidification. We're seeing really high rates of acidification in Washington state. It's expected to, acidity in our oceans are expected to increase 100 to 150% by the end of the century. And Washington, we have a really, our shellfish are so important for our economy, for our indigenous communities and their culture and livelihoods. And so we're seeing this affecting oysters, crabs, all of the shellfish that are so important in Washington they can't develop their shells as effectively as our ocean gets more acidic. And so that's affecting their populations pretty dramatically. And so mitigation, reducing our emissions, is really important to reducing the impacts of climate change on our wildlife and habitats. So for example, by limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 degrees, just half a degree of warming, globally means that the number of vertebrates, the number of animals with backbones and plant species, they're expected to lose, the expectation that they will lose over half of their range. So that the area that they're found in, that the idea that that could shrink in half, that risk is cut in half if we just can limit our warming by half a degree. The number of insect species.
Sorry, quickly, 1 minute warning.
Great. The number of insect species expected to lose over half the range is cut by 2/3 if we can limit warming by that half a degree. The amount of land area expected to be affected by that ecosystem transformation by turning into a different kind of community, that risk is halved by limiting it to that half a degree. And we have natural solutions. If we can just restore those forests, we can plant more trees, if we can restore our habitats, learn to store more carbon in our soils, we can use natural solutions to climate change just by managing our lands better to account for 37%, up to 37% of our emission reductions by 2030 to meet our Paris goal of keeping warming under 2 degrees. And finally, it's not just our forests. We also, again, we have these coastal habitats. We have things like seagrass. We have blue carbon where we can store emissions. And so, for example, if the entire Snohomish estuary in Puget Sound was restored, we could store almost 9 million tons of carbon over the next 100 years, offsetting 900 million gallons of gas or 1.7 million cars for a year. So lots of natural solutions out there as well. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Dr. Crosby. Appreciate your presentation. And we are just going to take a moment. You can stare off into the distance. I know we're doing a lot of looking at screens this morning. So if you need to stand up, if you need to stretch, just going to, I know this is a heavy topic and folks are processing it all differently. So take care of yourselves. Take deep breaths, stand up if you need to. Great. So we are going to move into the next presentation. And this presentation is by Paul Williams, who will be presenting on marine life as an expert presenter. Hi, Paul. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Morning.
Good morning. Senior biologist at the Suquamish tribe and provides assistance in all things related to shellfish, including resource management, ocean acidification research, and more. He's currently developing the Suquamish Climate Change Resilience Plan and helping the Puget Sound Partnership develop their action agenda. And the learning objective here is to learn about impacts of climate change on marine systems. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. So here we go. As I mentioned, I'm going to talk about impacts of carbon pollution on marine life. And next slide, please. First off, I just wanted to ask you all a question. Think about when this quote, when was it spoken and by whom? A couple of seconds, we can go to the next slide. So it was President Lyndon Johnson back in 1965. Generations altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale. So we've known about this problem for a long time, and it just keeps getting worse. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the ocean conditions. Ocean warming, sea level rise, decreased oxygen, ocean acidification are the big ones. There's a few others, but we won't get into that. I'll also try to touch on some of the impacts of the tribes. And also, I'm going to ask you another question, is whether you think we're in a state of emergency. And then I'll mention a few solutions that I've been thinking about. Thank you. Next. So here's a map of the ocean and of the heat content. It's been going up. And you can see the red spots. It's where it's quite a bit warmer. In a few areas it's cooler, but on the average, you see a lot of pink areas. One thing to note about the ocean is it covers 70% of the surface of the Earth. It feeds 3 billion people. And for most of those people, most of those 3 billion, the ocean provides their main source of protein. And the ocean provides half of the oxygen that we breathe. So you can think about it, every other breath you take comes from the ocean. Last little fact is that 80% of the population of the world's global population lives within 60 miles of the coast. And about 3/4 of the major cities, the big mega cities, are on the coast. So what happens when the ocean warms? Heat makes things bigger, it expands water, so we're getting sea level rise. So as that sea level rises, we have big issues with whoever's living next to the coast. So on the Pacific coast, there's several tribal communities that are going to have to move inland. And as Meg Mead mentioned, we've got coastal flooding happens when you have high tides plus storms. You get these massive storm surge, and you can get flooding into communities, into coastal areas. And when the sea level, when the flood goes back down, it brings with it all kinds of pollutants and toxins that might have been on the ground. So then it's a kind of an impact to all the marine life offshore. Another thing that's happening with sea level rise is that as the seawater intrudes, it actually raises the level of the groundwater, And that can cause flooding in basements. It can, break infrastructure, underground pipes, roads can buckle, and it also comes in and intrudes into agricultural areas. And so you get this salt water, and that doesn't, plants don't like salt water to grow in. So that's a major potential impact there. Next slide, please. Now, what happens to fish when they are in warmer water? Fish like to stay where the water suits them, so they can swim. They migrate to areas where it's a little cooler. And so in temperate areas, you're seeing more tropical and subtropical fish moving into temperate areas and harvested. And in the tropics, though, we're just going to see fewer fish. And that's where a lot of the folks that depend on food, on fishing for food resources live. So that's this is a very large impact in food security. Next slide, please. And we also have now, we mentioned the impacts that can be very fast or very slow. The shift in where the fish are is kind of a gradual impact, but 2014 to 2016, we had the blob out in the Pacific, and temperatures got 3 degrees higher than normal, 3 degrees Celsius, which is a lot for a fish that's used to being in 10-degree water. What happened there is that we had fisheries collapse in many different areas. They were just disasters. Chinook, the Fraser River sockeye didn't show up for a few years, cod in Alaska. And then also we had, next slide, please, a tremendous algal bloom. This isn't a picture of that bloom, but it's a picture of an algal bloom. And that was in 2017. And algal bloom, it's a harmful algal bloom. It contained domoic acid. Domoic acid creates permanent memory loss. And so crab fisheries were shut down, and the coastal economy, crab fishing economy, lost $97 million that year. Also, clam fisheries were shut down. So that impacted everyone on the coast, all the fishing communities. We also have harmful algal blooms here in Puget Sound. The main one happens is parabolic shellfish poison, and Department of Health checks every week for that. And so we open and close shellfish fisheries, clam and oysters and gooey ducks based on those reports. And those seem to be increasing. And scientists are looking at the relationship between harmful algal blooms and the changes happening in the water, and they're beginning to identify those links. Next slide, please. Another impact of what's going on the ocean and in Puget Sound, Hood Canal especially, is low oxygen. Fish, and everything, all animals need oxygen. And when and warm water just holds less oxygen. And when you combine that with a big algal bloom, when the algae blooms, it dies, the plant, it's decomposed by bacteria, and those bacteria use oxygen so they can deplete the water of oxygen. And then you get this combination, and you can get massive die-offs, and they're called dead zones, and they can happen every year or sporadically. In Hood Canal, we get them just every once in a while. Next slide, please. Now we're going to get into the ocean acidification impacts. So here's a slide from over in Hawaii, and you see the green. The red is the atmospheric CO2. The green is the CO2 in the water, and the blue is the pH of the water. As the thing about pH is that as you go down, as the acidity increases, the number decreases. So the bigger numbers are basic, lower numbers below 7 is acidic. So technically, the water is not getting more acidic, it's getting less basic. And so as acidity regulates all kinds of things in the body. If you want a little experiment, hold your breath. As you start to panic, that's not oxygen your body is sensing. It's actually carbon dioxide in your blood. That's what triggers the panic that happens, when you hold your breath. So how does ocean acidification, next slide, please. Here's the chemical process, and I'm including this, so for those who are interested in actually how it works. You've got atmospheric carbon dioxide going into the ocean. It gets dissolved, combines with water, forms carbonic acid, and then that carbonic acid breaks down into hydrogen ion. And here's where the problem occurs, is the hydrogen ion grabs a carbonate ion, forms bicarbonate. Now what a shell is, you go down and look right at the bottom, is calcium carbonate. It's a calcium ion plus a carbonate ion. So when the hydrogen grabs that carbonate, it forms bicarbonate, and it makes it so it's not available to shellfish to form their shells. So it's more energy for shellfish to form their shells, and that is causing problems for all sorts of animals. Pteropods, next slide, please. So here's this kind of a list of the various little creatures that are being impacted. Pteropods are also known as sea butterflies, and they float around. Very important prey item for all sorts of marine animals, and they're very susceptible, and their shells are dissolving slowly, but they're being impacted. Recent research, and then barnacles and bivalves. What happens with clams is that they can't form their shells fast enough, and if it's acidic water, that they die. Recent research is identified the problem with larval crab. There's little tiny holes popping up in their shells, and they're also smaller ones in acidified waters. And then as you get down to the bottom, you see jellyfish. Probably it's not going to be an issue for jellyfish. So if we lose shellfish, clams and crabs, there'll still be jellyfish, and maybe that'll be, we'll get used to eating those. Next slide, please. So the food web impacts are really, really important. Everything's connected, and these little coccolithophores are eaten by copepods, and they're eaten by salmon. So are the pteropods eaten by salmon. And then, of course, the orcas, salmon get eaten by orcas, and we like them also. Next slide, please. So those are the major impacts, ocean impacts, just kind of briefly. And then how does it impact tribes? Is that tribes have, treaty rights. I think somebody might have gone through these, but, back in 1855, the tribes entered a treaty with the federal government, and they gave up access to all the ceded areas here, and they just retained reservation lands and access to half of the natural resources. And for many years, the state ignored those treaties. Tribes had to sue. 1974, they won the Bolt decision, got access back to the salmon. In 94, got access to the shellfish. And I was hired by the tribe in 1991. My job was to help develop access to all the shellfish species. So it's next slide, please. It's been tremendously impactful for tribes to regain access. There's a source of income for dozens of families. We've got about 24 geoduck harvesters and about 20 crab fishermen, and then over 100 people go out and dig clams. We have worked to recertify areas for growing areas. We have a very expansive, large aquaculture operation where we replant clams, and we lease tidelands from private property owners and plant and harvest there also, and it gives them a little income.
I'm just going to jump in here. We've got 1 minute left.
1 minute left and go straight to the solutions. I have a couple of solutions. Next slide. So, you know, sadly, there's not much we in Washington, there's not a lot of technical fixes, you know, that we can do to cool the ocean back down or to stop ocean acidification. Those are global impacts that have global changes that have very local impacts. So we can do a couple of things. And well, let me, I kind of got ahead of myself. You got, you know, hatcheries can buffer the seawater so they can keep clams and oysters, get them through the very vulnerable larval stages, but you can't buffer the entire ocean. So, you know, that's not going to work for all the other species. You can grow seaweed, that works to a very limited extent, and we can protect eelgrass areas and kelp areas. That also helps. But really what we need to do is transition to clean energy. And that's happening right now. The price of electricity is, solar panels has really dropped. And there's tremendous potential. Then that's also where the jobs are. And the Department of Labor Statistics estimates that 51% of the will be increase of 51% in employment in that sector in solar power installation. So if you're interested in really addressing the bigger pictures of reducing carbon emissions and the shift to a just transition, looking at our school system and ensuring that the school system is providing education to underserved communities will both reduce the amount of emissions and also provide access to those good paying jobs. Too often, emerging opportunities are taken by people in positions, that have the money and resources to do that. And this is an opportunity to shift that. The public school system is $13 billion.
We do need to move on. So final thoughts from you?
Yes. The public school system, we spend $13 billion a year. It's nearly half the state budget. If we work there, we can change human behaviors and prepare youth for the green jobs of tomorrow. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation and for being here today. And we are going to take about 30 seconds before we introduce our next speaker. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Jessica Halofsky, and she'll be presenting on forest health and fires, as an expert presenter. Dr. Halofsky is the director of USDA's Northwest Climate Hub and the Forest Service Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center. Jessica pioneered one of the first climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation projects with Olympic National Forest and Park, and has since co-led 8 other sub-regional to regional scale climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation projects across the Western United States. Learning objective here is to learn about wildfires and their impacts on community and potential for healthy forests to be a component of climate mitigation. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Jessica Halofsky. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, thanks, Gretchen. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to hop right to it and talk about some recent statistics in our region. So many of you remember in 2014, we had Washington State's largest wildfire, over 250 acre fire in Eastern Washington called the Carlton Complex Fire. In 2015, also known as the year without snow, we had about 1.7 million acres burned in the Pacific Northwest, in Oregon and Washington, and over 9 million burned in the Western US. And this is a satellite image in August of 2015. So you can see that the large number of wildfires we had that year in our region. And we had a couple fires in 2015 that occurred on the west side conifer forests, including on the Olympic Peninsula, our temperate rainforest, where we measure rainfall in meters instead of centimeters. And these fire footprints are starting to collide. So this is an image around Mount Adams in southwestern Washington. And these are the footprints of 3 different fires we've had since 2008. And there's a location there. The areas in orange have burned twice since 2008. And that area in red has actually burned 3 times since 2008. So we're getting these areas of reburn over a relatively short period of time. And that's what that area that's burned 3 times looks like now. And then, of course, we had the Labor Day fires of 2020. So these are images mostly of Oregon, Western Oregon. Western Washington kind of dodged a bullet this year, although we did have some pretty severe fires on the east side. So in these events, we know that the east winds were a key driver of fire spread. We've actually seen events like this in the past, so we can't necessarily call them climate change fires. But what we can say is we know they're consistent with the kind of fires we might expect to occur more frequently in the future. So we're looking at, how are fires going to change in the future, and how do we know? So there are a couple of different sources of information we use to look at and project how fires might change in the future. And I'm going to go through a couple of examples of each of these. So the first is our paleoecological record. So that's a long word. But what do? We have in the bottom of lakes, in the sediment or the muck at the bottom of the lake, there are different layers of material that have been laid down over thousands of years. So what scientists do is they take cores of the sediments in the lake, and they look at pollen from different plant species, and they also look at charcoal. And with that information and where the pollen and charcoal occurs in that sediment, they're able to reconstruct climate and vegetation composition of the past. So we can look over time, and here on this left-hand side, the bottom is 17,000 years ago, going up to 0 to the present. And we can look at fire there on the left, and then we look at different species. Now, you don't have to get caught up in the details, except what we can see from this is both the climate has driven changes in our forest and vegetation communities over time, and it's also changed fire over time. And they've changed together. Shifts in fire have led to shifts in vegetation over time. So we expect these to occur with climate change in the future. We can also look at tree ring records. So we can, I know you've probably seen what a tree ring record looks like, but what you might not know is that fires actually leave a mark in these tree ring records. So by looking at these records under microscopes, we can say not only how trees have grown in the past and how quickly and how that has changed with climate, but we can also see when fires occurred in these records. And so we can say that in the past, in general in our region, when we've had warm and dry summers in the Pacific Northwest, we've had more fires. So in the future, we're expecting increasing air temperatures, We're expecting less summer rain than we already get. We're expecting the snow to melt off earlier. And this is all going to lead to drier fuels and drier forests. And so we have these longer fire seasons and more extreme fire hazard. We're expecting more fire to occur. And it really just takes a couple weeks of high temperature or low rainfall to really dry out our fuels in the summer. So exactly what are we expecting here in terms of the future? So these are our projections for the middle of the century. And what they show is, you have to look at the exact numbers, but overall in the Northwest, if our temperature, average annual temperatures increase by about 2 degrees Fahrenheit, we're looking at about 2 or 3 more times annual area burned. And the models might be slightly different in terms of what they project for the future, but there is absolute consistency among models that we are likely to see more fire in the Pacific Northwest with climate change in the future. And we're also expecting more large wildfires. So we have kind of our baseline normal here on the left for a historical period, and then future for up to 2020, which is about now, and then mid-century in the middle and end of century on the right. And basically what you can see is that the redder it gets, the more we're expecting increased suitability for large fires. So in Washington, this is particularly the case east of the Cascades. Not quite as much for the west side, but as we saw this year, we can have large west side fire events if the conditions are right. We also know that climate change affects insects. So this little guy is the mountain pine beetle. This is a native species. We've had mountain pine beetle infestations and attacks as a part of our forest ecosystems for centuries. But the warming we've seen with climate change has actually favored mountain pine beetle. It's able to actually increase its reproductive rate in some places where it used to take 2 years for a complete reproductive cycle. It's happening in 1. And the warmer temperatures have allowed it to expand its range to areas where it hasn't occurred historically. And these are the, in red here, the mountain pine beetle attacks across Western North America since 1990. And you can see British Columbia has been hit especially hard, but these mountain pine beetle outbreaks have affected over 50 million acres. And we're expecting these different disturbances to interact in the future. So we have climate, fire, insects, and disease, changes in vegetation with changing climate, and invasives. And these interactions do have the potential to cause some surprises in the future. So what does this mean for our Washington forests and beyond? Well, as I said, the high severity reburns are especially of concern, where we're getting several fires in the same place over a relatively short period of time, and like a 20 to 30 year period. And that's because it's really hard for forests to recover when we have those high severity reburns. And so in those cases, when we have these reburns, we probably won't have trees in those places for quite a long time, because it may be difficult for trees to regenerate and to get a seed into those areas. And we also have, effects of our past management. And with fire suppression, we put out most fires across our landscape. And this has meant that the forests have become denser over time, especially our forests that historically had a lot more fire. So these are our drier east side forests. And what that's done is it's created higher severity fires, where we have these large patches of almost complete tree mortality. And we're seeing in the past 50 years or so that we're getting these larger patches of high severity fire. And that those patches will be harder for seeds to get in there for our forests to regenerate in the future. We also know that tree seedling regeneration is very sensitive to climate. Now, our big 350-year-old Douglas fir trees, they can withstand quite a lot of climate variation. These little tree seedlings are much more sensitive, and so that's kind of a bottleneck. If we get a major fire event and then have extreme drought afterwards, it could take a long time for those forests to regenerate naturally. And again, we know that drought makes our tree species more susceptible to insect outbreaks and disease and mortality. And then we also could have some interactions with fire. So again, there's a potential for surprises with these interactions with our different forest disturbances. And then all of these changes, and especially these interactions with disturbances, have the potential to change what species we have, what kind of trees, what kind of shrubs, and the mixes of these we might have in the future. And there are some places where we're going to have more fire and more drought, where we might have different kinds of vegetation like shrublands in the future, because trees aren't able to compete in those locations anymore. So of course, this has implications for our carbon storage. When we have these transitions in ecosystem types from forest to non-forest, when we have our large fire events, we really have the potential to lose a lot of carbon across the landscape. I did want to point out that there's some resources that are available. We just published a synthesis on how changing wildfire is affecting changing forests in the Pacific Northwest. This is open access. I can put the links here. We also developed a very general 2-page fact sheet if you're interested in taking a look, and also a story map that has it's a more visual way to interact with this information. I do want to mention there's some information on adaptation in here. I didn't have time to go into a lot of that today, but I will say that there's some trade-offs between forest health and carbon storage. And in some cases, the actions we take to reduce risk of fire to communities, continue to provide wildlife habitat, and keep our fire hazard down overall is not necessarily going to be a good thing for carbon in all types of forests. So there is that trade-off there, but it is very important to consider the projections for future fire when we're thinking about carbon and mitigation in particularly our fire-prone forests on the east side of the state. With that's all I have today, but feel free to get in touch with me if you have any other questions or want any other resources. Thank you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Halofsky, for joining us and presenting today. And we have one additional presenter and interested party who'll be presenting in just a moment before we move into our question and answer period. We've got a lot of great questions coming through in chat. We are going to take just about 30 seconds between presenters to spend however you want to spend it, but just to give you all a little bit of breathing room between presenters. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jessica Randall, for joining us. Yeah, Jessica will be presenting on actions to improve forest health and resilience as an interested party presenter. And Jessica is interested in the impacts of climate change on forest health and has formed the Emergency Conservation Committee of the Pacific Northwest, a local environmental group, as a platform for environmental education and action. So hearing from her on a local perspective about actions to improve forest health and resilience. Thanks for being here, Jessica.
And thanks for inviting me. So my name is Jessica Randall. I'm an acupuncturist, and I live on 16 acres of forest land in Jefferson County. I live on land that was originally the territory of the Chimicum people. Some of what I tell you, it will be a reiteration of what we've already heard today, but my focus is more on what we can do to improve forest health and resilience. And I'll be giving you a copy of my research to the Climate Assembly, so it'll be available to you if you want to look at my references. Anyway, I want to thank the Washington Climate Assembly and you for being such a positive, a part of positive change. And slide 2, please. The forest makes up 52% of our state's land and is therefore a large part of our climate change agenda. And at this point, our trees are the best way we can sequester carbon, and their survival is paramount. Culturally, we've been thinking of climate change adaptation as a punishment, as a step down, but I see it as progress. I'm a healthcare practitioner, and I treat people with physical and emotional issues. Living more in tune with the environment may be something our society needs to be healthier in both body and spirit. Slide 3. The forest is not only the trees, but it's an entire ecosystem. The ecosystem is a dynamic, diverse, and interdependent network of all living and non-living things, plants, animals, fungi, soil, water, and we're a part of that as well. All of these parts depend on one another for vitality and survival. Number 4, slide. We're just now discovering that a significant part of forest health resides in the mycorrhizal network under the soil, and this fungal matrix connects the trees and other plants to one another and acts as a transportation system for water sharing and nutrient sharing. It's one way the trees can survive drought. Our forests have been evolving for 200 million years, and climate change is happening too quickly for our forests to adapt. We're beginning to experience negative side effects such as wildfire and tree die-off, and we have to accept that the forest is changing, but there are things that we can do to help it happen with less disastrous consequences. Slide, please. Climate change itself is a stressor, but the forest ecosystem has actually been in decline for the last 200 years, and we're responsible for that. In the early 1800s, when European settlers migrated into Washington, we began over-harvesting the trees, disrupting the soil and killing off most of the elk, who, by the way, ate that brushy understory, which played a big part in forest fire management. We've improved our forest practices since then, but unfortunately, we're still doing harm. The term forest practices refers to the legal regulations for harvesting timber and forest recovery. Slide, please. Medically speaking, we could say that our forest ecosystem is now suffering from a chronic disease with a host of opportunistic infections. When there's stress on the forest, the trees become more vulnerable to dry, hot summers and warmer and wetter winters. Their immune systems are weakened, which makes them susceptible to diseases and pest infestations, and invasive species take over. The changes that we can make now are in our forest practices, and let me describe how some of these practices affect the forest ecosystem. Slide, please. Clear cutting is logging all of the trees in a large area. Clear cut lots are hot and dry in the summer, which affects species, habitat, streams, and other wetlands. When a forest is clear cut, the soil disturbances damage the mycorrhizal network. Clear cutting also increases flooding and water runoff in the winter, which carries excess silt and other debris into the streams and lakes, harming the salmon reproductive cycle and damaging roads. All clear cuts are then treated with herbicides, often applied by helicopter. This process kills off all of the vegetation. The chemicals seep into the soil with the rain, running into streams and lakes, causing other problems such as blue-green algae overgrowth and injury to amphibians and other creatures. Monoculture planting is the common practice of planting only one tree species. In Western Washington, it's the Douglas fir because it's the most lucrative. This limits species diversity, but it also attracts certain pathogens and pests which love the conifers. Those pests migrate into the forest reserves and the riparian zones. Riparian zones are nutrient-rich and species-rich areas that are specifically located near streams and wetlands, and they're ecologically vital and are especially sensitive to damage. I know riparian might be a word that you're not familiar with. The harvesting cycles of commercial timber farms are now half as long as they used to be. The trees are so weak that they need to be harvested for about every 25 to 30 years after they were planted, instead of every 50 to 60. This shorter span further weakens the forest by increasing the frequency of the other practices. Next slide, please. All right, let's look at what's going on. I'm just going to go through this quickly. It's a review. Ecosystem concerns, mycorrhizal disturbance, nutritionally poor soil, native species decline, invasive species takeover, pollution, desiccation, that means dryness, flooding and runoff, and which then cause these specific problems for trees: slow growth, compromised immune systems, overcrowding, opportunistic infection or disease and insect infestation, and fire risk. Okay, next slide, please. So the important thing, what can we do about it? I focused earlier on 4 forest practices: clear cutting, herbicides, monocultures, and short harvest cycles. But there are more things we can do to help our trees into the next century. Some of these actions are from our own Department of Natural Resources, and others are from forestry experts and environmental studies. So I'll go through some of these, and some of these I'll skip because of time. But basically, that first one, establish an equal dialogue between nature and industry. This may seem lightweight, but it is perhaps one of the most important issues we have. The inequality between the timber industry and the environment has become an impediment to most environmental initiatives in Washington state. If you're interested in this, look up rights of nature. Stop clear cutting and implement variable density thinning. A local forestry expert named Mallory Weinheimer told me about this. It's a timber harvesting technique that preserves the forest ecosystem and grows large and healthy trees. It would be a great alternative to clear cutting. Number 3, avoid the use of herbicides. I believe there are solutions other than using chemicals like glyphosate and other cancer-causing chemicals. We have to talk about noxious weeds and the invasive species and how to deal with those. So number 4, increase the size of.
Sorry to interrupt.
1 minute?
1 minute, yeah, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Increase the size of protected zones around riparian areas. Remember those sensitive areas. Currently, they're about 25 to 50 feet, but they should really be extended to about 100 to avoid the chemical runoff and other damaging effects. So a lot of these other things, like limit logging on public lands until we are more carbon neutral, lengthen harvest cycles when possible, use local resources for milling and wood products manufacturing, support businesses which produce sustainable materials so we can give our forests a rest for a little while and regenerate, and improve restoration in general with drought-resistant natives and that kind of thing. Develop products for trees that we actually have in our area. That'll keep us from having to ship things and keep our carbon footprint down. Okay, next slide. It's up to us to do this. Confronting our own role in climate change is difficult to do, but if we don't take responsibility for our actions, we will have no power to change them. There has always been a lag time between scientific findings and legislative action. Sometimes this lag time has been months or years, or as we've seen with climate change, it's been decades. We've allowed our legislation to lean toward corporations and profit, not toward the preservation of nature. Now, with global warming, we need to change our priorities. Nature should be our main concern right now, and the trees are the highest priority. And my final slide just has my name and website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Thanks for sharing your local perspective. And with that, we're going to move into the question and answer period. We've been getting a lot of great questions throughout the course of the morning today, and reminding folks it's never too late to submit a question. So even though we've been bringing the questions that we've been seeing in the chat, moving them into our shared document to know what question comes next, there's always time to ask a question. And with that, I will move into the first question. This is a question for Dr. Mead. You mentioned, from Travis from Snohomish, you mentioned 37% of our emission reductions could be accomplished by restoring forests and coastal habitats. How do we do that?
Is that from? Oh, this is a Q&A. Okay, because I sent some more information in the chat to folks, a really nice Nature Conservancy piece on this. So I guess the solutions that I've mostly seen have been around 3 areas, and they're described there, but it's around maintaining and restoring habitat. So reforestation, restoring our forests. It could be here in Washington, especially blue carbon. So Paul Williams was talking about that as well. Restoring our coastal marshes, our seagrass beds. So a lot of it is about restoration, reforestation, replanting habitats. There's a lot to do with also how we use land. So there's a lot of our natural solutions also lie in agriculture, and the kind of farming that we do to maximize carbon storage in our soils, and also what we're growing. And so a lot of those natural solutions also have to do with emphasis on using more plant-based diets. I don't want to get too involved here because I know there's a lot that goes into talking about what we eat and the implications of that for all kinds of justice issues. But one of the key natural solutions in there is around what we grow and what we eat and how we grow it. But if you want more information on that, I would recommend reading the piece that I put in the chat earlier, because there's a nice video in there about natural solutions. But I will say that there've been a lot of hype around, like, we just need to plant 1 billion trees and plant them everywhere. And that, I just want to be clear, that's a really an oversimplification, because a lot of places trees don't belong. So I would say more generally, it's about restoring our natural habitats, and particularly those that store a lot of carbon, like our Northwest forests and blue carbon, the carbon stored in our coastal habitats.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is from Angela from Vancouver for Dr. Holoski. If increasing fires are inevitable, then what can be done after to mitigate destruction or speed up regrowth? Have scientists developed any solutions?
Yeah, there are a lot of approaches to reforestation. I guess what we have to be careful of in reforesting some of our forests is that if we plant too many trees there and they all grow back, and that creates a lot of fuels, and those forests may be susceptible to fires in the future. So the U.S. Forest Service in our region doesn't do that much reforestation anymore, partly because of funding, but also because we get natural regeneration in a lot of these places, and it's not as dense as the trees aren't as dense as they would be if we planted. But really, where we can reduce fire hazard and risk is through what we do before a fire occurs. And there are ways to reduce fuels, especially around houses and places that we really value. And that can be through thinning our forests, making them less dense. And it can be with hazardous fuel treatments, getting a lot of those small sticks on the forest floor out, getting rid of some of the small trees. And prescribed burning can also play a role in that. It serves the same purpose of reducing our fuel levels in our dry forests. Not so much on our west side forests, but on our dry east side forests can reduce fuels and lower fire risk.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Catherine from Bainbridge Island for Paul Williams. Uncertain why we declare a state of emergency, how that benefits, or how big is the state of emergency to cover?
Well, I think that it's an action that can. It's with politicians. If they accept a principle, then they could act, and it's a declaration that we need to do something. We've known about this for a long time, and we don't seem to be really making much progress. And I think it's because that we think somebody else maybe coming down the line will fix it. And at some point, I think you have to decide that this is something we have to act on now. And by declaring it a state of emergency, that could mobilize people to act. It could get other people to think about whether it is an emergency and whether we need to take actions. I think with education, we have a very, very slow rate of change in education. It's a very enormous potential that if we could reform education, get lessons that are up to date into classrooms, people could change behaviors and also prepare for the future. And unless we declare a state of emergency, I mean, I think it would help make other changes. I'll leave it at that.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Jessica Randall from Travis in Snohomish. What besides the preservation of the environment and combating climate change is in it for logging companies to change their practices?
Well, logging and other milling and wood harvesting, it actually has gone down significantly since probably 1940 or 50. I know we have dips around the Depression and that kind of thing. And as what's happening with these large timber companies is that they're often selling off property that was forested, that was forest land, for real estate and things like that. And so they're actually becoming smaller and smaller, and they have been doing that for a long time. And so what we're seeing instead are these other companies, like they're called like CLT companies. What are those? That composite laminated timber manufacturers, people who are taking some wood products, but then they're also combining them with other composite materials, some of them recycled, even from like Boeing fuselage, amazingly. Has a lot of carbon in it, has a lot of, elements that we can use for building materials. They're starting to develop those products. And I think that that's our natural way that we're going anyway. So we might as well just subsidize and assist those corporations to help, have these other sustainable materials processing plants and things like that, and that kind of research. We have to go through, process to make sure it's standard for construction and all of that. But a lot of these things are already being developed in Europe, and we can, we have like, we can even follow like Sweden's lead and Germany's lead and say, what are you doing with your forests? I know that there's a whole thing with like biochar and stuff like that, but I kind of feel like we're just going to shift, and we might as well do that more consciously and take care of our loggers that way, give them something else to do.
So. And the next one is like, yeah, that's helpful. Mm-hmm. Thank you. This next one is a combined question from Clifton from Wenatchee and Angela from Vancouver for Dr. Holofsky. You mentioned about forest patches that are more susceptible. If the patches can be identified, wouldn't targeted forest management be a good mitigator? And how expensive is this?
Yeah, absolutely. We can try to, and there are scientists who are looking into this now, trying to figure out where we have repeated high severity fires. Are there locations on the landscape where that happens? Are there locations on the landscape where that doesn't happen, where we might expect there to be conditions to persist with climate change? They're kind of, we call them refugia. But in the patches where there are repeated high severity fires, we could look at those and try to reduce fuel levels in those areas. And it is expensive, and it's difficult because our land management agencies don't have sufficient funding to do as much of this kind of work as we would like. There are some more initiatives with our state, Washington Department of Natural Resources. They're putting a lot of resources into that kind of work on the east side of Washington. They're working more and more with federal agencies to do that kind of thing, but the cost is prohibitive in many cases. I think you're still muted.
I was still muted. Thank you. The next question is from Garrett from Cleellum. Does any local, state, or national government provide subsidies to farms for carbon sequestration similar to growing corn or soy? And does one presenter want to take that?
I can say I'm not aware of any such subsidies.
Okay. Great, thank you. Next question is from Travis from Moses Lake for Dr. Holofsky. Can we decrease the occurrence and severity of the forest fires with increased forest management services?
I'm not sure what you mean by forest management services. I guess we could look at wood products as an ecosystem service. There are some initiatives to, the problem with the fuel reduction treatments is that they should be focused on smaller diameter stems. So these aren't necessarily our valuable timber products that we're used to. And so it's hard to get monetary value out of taking that material out of the forest. And that's a continuing problem. There are some potential solutions that people are looking into. And so biomass burning was one of those that there have been a lot of people looking into that possibility. There are more and more mills who will take small diameter stems and use them for wood products more than I think has been the case in the past, but that's still a challenge, is to make those treatments economically feasible instead of just a loss.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And with that, we are going to close our Q&A portion for the first set of presenters and move into our break and/or optional networking with your fellow assembly members. And just a couple of reminders, we are going to use the same groups that we used on Tuesday night at the end of the session to move into these breakouts. You do not need to turn on your screen. You do not need to unmute yourself. This is your break to spend how you want, but we just want to provide additional opportunities to try to create the space as if we were together in a room and you were going to get a cup of coffee or grab some snacks and speaking to other assembly members during those times. But it is optional. And other reminder, just if you are sharing something, these groups they're smaller than 80, but they're still bigger than, say 10. If you've spoken, giving other folks a chance to speak as well. And speaking from your own experiences and not passing judgment on something that somebody else is sharing. So being respectful to everyone in your group. And with that, Emily, if you want to just let me know when we head into the breakout rooms, you will automatically be whisked into a breakout room. And again, optional how you spend your time before we reconvene for the second set of presentations.
And what time are we coming back, or how many minutes do we have, Gretchen?
Great question. Mike, how many minutes do we have for this?
We will have until 11:34.
Okay, so almost 10 minutes. Great, which was our intention.
Great, and I think Derek should have that set up. Is that right?
I did not actually set that up.
Oh, okay. Apologies for that.
So bear with us as we get the breakout room set up, and then you will be whisked away, but feel free to take a break. We are reconvening in roughly 10 minutes from now.
Okay, I'm pulling them together. And in the interest of time, they will be randomized this time, but we'll have them set up in the same breakdown for the campfire session. So, one more minute. Okay, you're opening now.